So this is our topic for today. This is actually a series that Professional Development College through Lourdes Brent has set up for the next few months. So we actually, in the middle of the month, have a series. This is the first one, California Drought and the Water Future of Los Angeles. But we have other topics, including California fire, biodiversity, climate change, and all of these are, of course, provided for you by the Sustainable Environment Institute, which is a project of the District Academic Senate. So that we're very happy to have this opportunity to share with faculty what I hope will also be resources for teaching, as well as content that may in some cases be old hat, because we're all Californians and we know that old phrase of whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, a great myth of Western concepts, but we know that we live in a very water scarce environment and that climate change is affecting that very profoundly. So there are some sort of topical issues, and you can see it's a lot to chew in an hour and a half, and I'm hoping to actually get through these. There's a sort of from the general to the particular, or from the global to the local. So we will be starting out with the big pictures of climate change and its impacts, and then zeroing in on California and its western watersheds, and working all our way down to Los Angeles and what we're going to do. I want to actually share with you what I think is, I'm going to sort of give away the idea that I'm going to end on an optimistic note, and that is, prior to my moving down to Los Angeles when I lived in the Bay Area, my impression of Southern California was that people were profligate with water, that they had kidney-shaped swimming pools, that they washed their cars, that they wasted water. And when I moved to LA, I found out nothing is further from the truth. Angelenos have achieved phenomenal gains in water conservation, probably more so than any other population in California. So I think there's a lot to look forward to and a lot of opportunities to secure what should be the drinking water supply for the millions of people that live in Southern California. I'm going to start with actually a short video that tells the whole story with very good imagery.
Population of 39 million people, California is by far the most populous state in the US, with Greater Los Angeles being the second largest urban region in the country. And the water needs are high, as California has a strong economy with a gross state product of $3.2 trillion in 2019. To better illustrate this figure, it is worth comparing it with entire nations. California alone would be the 5th largest economy in the world, just ahead of India. And the economic activities extend across all sectors: industry and finances, media and film, the information industry in the Silicon Valley, trade, as well as agriculture. All these factors lead to an enormous demand for water. In total numbers, California is the largest consumer of water in the United States. In this video, we want to understand how this supply is maintained and what some future challenges might be. First, let's take a look at California's geography. Note that this is a map with extremely exaggerated topography. There are several significant mountain ranges across the state. Northern California has the Klamath Mountains. Along the Pacific Ocean, there are the northern and southern coast ranges. And to the south, we find the transverse ranges and the peninsula ranges. To the east is Sierra Nevada, the highest mountain range in the state. This mountainous landscape contrasts with the large, flat area that characterizes the interior of the state, the Central Valley. At the same time, there is the Colorado Desert, as well as the driest desert in North America, the Mojave Desert. So geographically, California is a very diverse state. It is home to both the highest point of the contiguous United States, Mount Whitney, and the lowest point, Death Valley. And the many mountain ranges are crucial to water supply, as about 30% of California's water comes from snowpack. For example, the snowfall in Sierra Nevada supplies large parts of the Central Valley with water. The Central Valley consists of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Valley, named after these two important rivers in the state, with the Sacramento River being the larger source of fresh water as it receives approximately 2/3 of Northern California's precipitation. These rivers eventually join and flow through the Carquinez Strait into the Bay of San Pablo and San Francisco. The river's delta is an important source of freshwater withdrawal in the state. The Central Valley Project uses a series of dams and artificial canals to divert both rivers to supply the entire Central Valley. These canals are essentially artificial rivers that help distribute the water. This allows better water management, prevention of floods and droughts, and renewable power generation. It even enables a more effective use of land, as dams allow large cities to grow close to river valleys without the risk of flood during spring. And thanks to the canals that distribute fresh water for agricultural irrigation in the valley, the dry environment of the San Joaquin Valley, located a little further south, has been transformed into arable land. But water isn't just distributed within the Central Valley. After all, the supply in the Los Angeles area and San Diego is a particularly big challenge. And nowadays, it's only possible thanks to enormous efforts. When it comes to supplying LA with surface water, 3 projects in particular stand out. The Los Angeles Aqueduct consists of 2 separate canals that tap water from the Owens River and its tributaries in the Owens Valley and then transports it to Los Angeles. But diverting this water caused environmental damage. The Owens Lake was deprived of its tributaries, which led to the lake drying up. And at times, increased withdrawal and additional canals also threatened water levels at Mono Lake, an important spot for bird migration. Another large source of water is the Colorado River. Water is transported to cities in Southern California using a series of partly above ground and partly underground canals. In certain parts, the water has to be pumped over high mountain passages using pumping stations. But the longest such canal project is the California Aqueduct. It transports water from Clifton Court Forebay in the San Joaquin River Delta all the way to the southern part of the state. Along the way, there are considerable differences in altitude, and the water has to be pumped from many places using a lot of energy, especially over the Tehachapi Mountains that must be crossed on this route. At the Edmonston pumping plant, the water is raised an entire 587 meters or 1,926 feet. At other places, the water drops abruptly. Here, hydropower stations are used to recapture as much energy as possible. But it becomes clear that enormous efforts and costs are necessary to provide for the densely populated cities in Southern California. So it can be said, water from the Sacramento and San Joaquin River is essential to the state's water supply, and their potential for providing water across the state is increased by enormous infrastructure, for example, in the Central Valley Project for enabling agriculture, or in the California State Water Project for the drinking water supply in Southern California. Water for this region is taken from the river delta between the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin, which is also used for supply in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. In total, this river delta supplies around 25 million people, 2/3 of California's population, with drinking water. Of this, 67% is exported for use in the Central Valley Project, and 26% goes to the State Water Project. However, it is important that the withdrawal is strictly monitored. If not enough water flows through the delta into the bay, salty water from the Pacific Ocean threatens to intrude the delta and reduce water quality. Even in normal years, the water supply in the state is already strained, and during droughts, the situation gets extremely difficult. Another important source of water is groundwater, which usually accounts for about 30% of the supply in a normal year. But in years of intense drought, This percentage can rise up to 60% or more, a level of depletion that is not considered sustainable. Due to climate change, more extreme weather events are to be expected, such as more frequent droughts, as well as extreme precipitation events, which in turn can lead to floods. The 2012 to 2016 drought is considered one of the most extreme ones in California's history and has brought many farms into crisis. Water supply in modern California is only possible due to enormous efforts and large achievements. While there have been many successes, these projects also cause damage to complex ecosystems and habitats. And they create water conflict between communities as well as between cities and farmers. In addition, many Native American tribal lands have been flooded in the past in favor of dam projects. Many measures are being taken in order to use the limited amount of precipitation in the state as efficiently as possible. This includes dams, canals, and increased use of seawater desalination on one hand, and measures to reduce water consumption on the other, such as water meters in every home, restrictions on private withdrawal, water recycling, and modern irrigation methods. However, further improvements in all of these areas will be necessary to achieve a sustainable water supply in the state.
Yes, good question. To achieve a sustainable water supply in the state, what we're witnessing today in conjunction with what we broadly recognize as climate change, though it's perhaps more aptly named climate crisis, is this persistent drought over the southwestern states, over the western states in general, with record temperatures, for example, in Oregon and Washington State and Vancouver, British Columbia, that had never been even measured before. And the reasoning behind this is a meteorological phenomenon known as a high pressure ridge, and that has been renamed as a heat dome. We don't have time to go into the meteorology of this, except to say that scientists are reasonably convinced, sure, that the current drought that we're experiencing, but especially the very hot temperatures in northwestern states and British Columbia, are directly a consequence of climate change. When we talk about climate in a future seminar, I'll go into some of the science behind how those calculations are made. Suffice to say that a persistent high pressure system prevents precipitation, and it also traps hot air in this way. So that in June 2020, if you were looking at the relatively dry parts of the western states compared to June 2021, you can see that we are indeed in a very extreme drought condition. Now, many ways of measuring the drought condition have to do with knowing how much water is in storage behind dams, and what is then the above average or below average storage, as well as the statewide drought. So you can see the 1990 drought, the 2016 to 2006, 2014, and then the third one, the most recent one. And then you can see for those same periods of drought, what would be the net groundwater recharge. This is important because what we're not so aware of in California is that the way that the farm sector, big agriculture, makes up its water deficit in the San Joaquin Valley is through the extraction of groundwater, which we also know with the word aquifer. So an aquifer is an underground deposit of water that, when reachable, technologically becomes part of the water balance sheet for agriculture. However, the tendency almost everywhere in the world is to extract groundwater at a higher rate than what's called the recharge. So the recharge is actually a slow process where melting snow and ice and precipitation slowly percolate their way back into an aquifer, bringing it back to its normal volume level. But what we do actually throughout the world, but particularly in Western states, is what's called water mining, meaning that we are not only removing water at a faster rate than recharge, but sadly, we're also removing water that's relic water. What physical geographers call relic water is water that's 1,000 years old. So the recharge rate is slow, and when you remove water at the higher than the recharge rate, you get what you see in these two graphs, with the impacts on precipitation and then the average higher temperatures. So these are the images that now we've gotten quite used to. We've seen them before. This shows you what was in 2013, 2014, as far as what we call snowpack of the Sierra. So this is a satellite image of the Sierra Nevada going into, you can see Lake Tahoe and Mono Lake and Pyramid Lake, and there is the border with Nevada. So we literally ran out of water. And these are the sad images of fire areas. But now for 2019 and 2020, we have a repeat, much less snowpack. And yet, as you saw in the video, we depend on this snowpack because it's the melting of snow in the spring and summer that fills our impoundments, which is the water behind a dam. And now you can see what these impoundments look like with a combination of drought and fire. It's a Stygian landscape. It is indeed very depressing for people who have familiar with this landscape in the past. It is changed, and sadly, it has probably changed irreversibly. When you look at this amount of die-off or removal or burning of trees, you lose the process whereby trees transport water from the ground into the atmosphere. So when you lose your trees, you also then see a concomitant drop in precipitation. The result being what we're seeing now with increased encouragement to ration our water. Rationing water in California is always a very, very difficult process because while urban water users only represent 20% of the demand on the California water systems, and agriculture represents 80%, the agricultural lobby in Sacramento is incredibly powerful, and they're also quite powerful even in Washington, D.C. The Republican leader in the House of Representatives represents a district in the Central Valley of California. This was the 2017 impoundment crisis. You can see that only Shasta and maybe the Don Pedro reservoirs had their historical averages. This is 2019, we had an unusually wet year, and you can see that many of them are exceeding their historical averages. This is March 2nd, 2020, and you can also see that we were enjoying what was essentially a couple of wet years. This is the situation in 2021 with Shasta being at half of its average. And in fact, none of these except Don Pedro, which is kept full for all kinds of urban reasons, are actually below. The Maloney's and Don Pedro being the only ones that could be maintained at their historical average. And then this is June 27, 2021. A true crisis where all of our impoundments are below their historical levels, in some cases way below their historical levels, less than half of what they normally would have behind the dam. The problem then for reservoir conditions, this is just one of those, which is Lake Oroville. Lake Oroville stands out because it had the famous accident of its spillway, where a very heavy rain year destroyed the concrete process where Lake Oroville spill water goes down below the dam. It took millions of dollars and over a year to repair that, but it is a good indicator. And what you see in this kind of data are, three different variables. One would be, what is the historical average? The other one would be, what is the total reservoir capacity? So those are in blue. And then you have the 1976, 1977 drought, which is on record the driest we had in recent times. And then the 1977, 1976 conditions, which were wetter, and 82 to 83, which were the wettest. So this provides some sense of contrast between what we can expect in California in dry years and what has historically been true in the last 30 or 40 years with the wet years. But then the 2019-2020 is the black line, and the 2014-2016 drought is the line with the red triangles, and the current situation is the blue one. So you can see the blue one is way below those two wet years we had of 2019, 2020, and is in fact at par with, even threatens to match the very bad conditions we had in 76 and 77. As far as snowpack, the sad truth is that the snowpack is rather absent. And what that indicates is that we really have to recalculate what is our water year. Water years in California are measured from the beginning of the rainy season, which is October, November, until the end of the rainy season, which happens in April and May. So that's really when we get most of our water throughout the state. That said, the real conundrum with California has been the first one is, what is actually the trends over a period of 100 years, 110 years. And you can see that we've had wet years and dry years, wet years and dry years. And that's actually normal for this region, this Mediterranean climate that we have. While we have some consistency in what we can expect as far as rainfall and snowfall, it's inconsistent when you look at small periods of time where you have an exceptionally dry year, maybe an exceptionally wet year. Overall, though, the tendency in precipitation in our rain years is for a decline that you can see there following 2010. The surface water systems of the state of California, which are rivers and streams and lakes, are mainly the wet side or the windward side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So since all of our weather systems move from west to east, the Sierra Nevada acts as a bit of a barrier to that moisture, and that's why the wet side of the Sierra has all of these rivers, which some of them we've gotten to know quite well because either we've been there or we've rafted there. The Kern River, the Kings River, the Merced, the Tuolumne, the Mokelumne. These are all rivers that feed the San Joaquin and the Sacramento. So the river delta becomes the place where the drainage system of the Sierra Nevada meets the ocean. It becomes the location for what is a lot of engineering, a lot of conflict, a conflict that in the 1970s even took the form of what was then Governor Jerry Brown's plan for what he called the peripheral canal. The idea of the peripheral canal was to build yet another canal from the Sacramento region around the Delta and down to Stockton, down to the Forebay, the Clifton Forebay, the Delta pumping stations. It was on the ballot, and voters very interestingly voted against it. Well, the reason they voted against it was that the peripheral canal would have surely destroyed the deltaic region. Note the size of the San Joaquin Sacramento River Delta. It's enormous. And in fact is complicated. The hydrology of that region is very complicated, and it's in fact an estuary, as is the entire San Francisco Bay. What an estuary is a place where rivers meet the ocean. So you have a mix of fresh water and salt water. The fresh water that comes from the Delta pushes away the salt water, but in dry years, the salt water intrudes into the Delta, so that the biota, the vegetation, the fish, the marine creatures that live there can actually tolerate quite a range in terms of how fresh is the water or how salty is the water. They thrive in what we might call brackish water, which is water that's not quite 3.4% salt like the ocean. It's a little less than that. And that's why deltaic lands and estuaries become so interesting, because of the ability of life forms that have evolved there to tolerate quite a range in salinity. But without the fresh water draining through the Delta, you're basically going to salinate the Delta. The major conveyances, which we've seen just in the video we just watched, as far as we're concerned in Los Angeles, there are really three that bring surface water to the city of Los Angeles. The first one being the very famous aqueduct that Mulholland built from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. It is a sordid tale that has been immortalized in the film Chinatown. So if you've ever seen the film Chinatown, you know that there was a lot of cheating and a lot of subterfuge in obtaining fresh water for the city of Los Angeles. But before Mulholland's aqueduct was built, Los Angeles was in a sense a dusty little town, meaning that the capacity of the city to grow was really limited to what people could draw out of wells, out of aquifers, out of the ground. To this day, many communities in Los Angeles get their water supply from those aquifers. Cities like Pasadena and formerly cities like Santa Monica used to actually take water from the aquifer until we built the very complicated conveyance system that delivers Owens Valley water to the city. The red one is the State Water Project. And what former Governor Jerry Brown argued was that all of these water projects were almost complete, except for one thing. And he called it the fix. The fix was, instead of building a canal around the delta, why don't we drill tunnels underneath it to convey the water from Sacramento down to the Tracy pumping stations and down to the Clifton Forebay, and not disturb the deltaic water exchanges. They also had engineered a very complicated process of releases of fresh water and diversions of fresh water in order to inhibit the Pacific Ocean from intruding into the deltaic lands. But Governor Newsom inherited that project and decided that maybe one tunnel is better than two. The tunnels are widely opposed by environmentalists for a very good reason. And I should mention that opposition is even included in the Sacramento Bee. So this isn't exactly a sort of greeny woolly point of view, that who is going to get this water? Jerry Brown would like to say it's for our growing population. That isn't true. The real target for that increased supply is Central Valley agriculture. And it really begs the question, how much do we understand in terms of Central Valley agriculture? And to what extent have we been misled by that very powerful lobby in Sacramento to misperceive what is actually the water needs and water budget of the state and the best policy regarding who gets the water and when. So here, one of the things to understand is how large amounts of water are measured. Gallons is too small a unit. So the acre foot is the way that we refer to large volumes of water in the United States. If a football field is an acre, if you flood it with 12 inches of water, you have 1 acre foot, which is 326,000 gallons. So when we talk about millions of acre feet, that's the way that we measure water in California. There's yet another unit, which is even larger than the acre foot, and that would be the cubic kilometer. And that is also used for measuring, for example, all of the water in California. So it's the amount of water used by 2 average families in a year is an acre foot. So what do we have in California that is a conundrum, that is in many ways a contradictory process? The first one is the fact that when you look at precipitation in the state, and you look at how much we get from that precipitation, we get 71 million acre feet on average. Now, there's actually, we get upwards of that. We get somewhere between 90 and 200, about 200 million acre feet before evaporation. So we do lose about half of our surface water in California to evaporation. That isn't a bad thing. What that means is that you're adding water moisture to the atmosphere and you're going to help in further precipitation. However, people who hold water rights in California divert in aggregate 250 million acre feet of water each year. So it begs the question, how is this reasonable and how is it even beneficial? My students at Santa Monica College read in our environmental studies textbook a very interesting text, which I want to repeat to you because it will show you to what extent we are often befuddled, if not downright confused, by driving up Highway 5. I don't know how recently you've done that, but what you see is the exhortation by Central Valley farmers to insist that their water rights come first. They even say, if you want water, build more dams. So the cynics will say that California growers, and we don't call them farmers, we do call them growers, won't be happy until they get the last drop. So what's going on? Well, consider California. Does the water go into high value specialty crops such as wine grapes or almonds? For the most part, the answer is no. Nearly half of all the water used in California's agriculture sector goes into growing grass and alfalfa. Low-value crops that are used almost exclusively for hay. More than 60% of the agricultural water of the Golden State goes into 4 crops: grass, alfalfa, rice, and cotton. The largest percentage of these 4 crops are literally being grown in a desert in the state's Central Valley, which receives only 5 inches of rain per year across the southern region. In addition, more than half of all the water used in irrigation in the United States never makes it to the plants, being mostly instead lost through leaks, evaporation, and runoff. Deeply subsidized irrigation water is said to be vital for jobs in rural areas. In other words, wasteful use of water can help people. But studies in California by the Pacific Institute, a very reputable water policy institute in Oakland, California, show that over the course of a year, 1,000 acre feet of water supports just 12 jobs in agriculture, or only 1 job if the water is used in some of California's high volume, low value crops that are almost water intensive, such as rice. 1 acre foot of water is a lot. It's about 300,000 gallons, or roughly the amount of water used by a family over the course of a year. 1,000 acre feet of water supports an average of 1,000 jobs if used in schools, and 20,000 jobs if used in industry. Right now, the exhortation of Governor Newsom in Sacramento is that the responsibility for water conservation is falling disproportionately on the urban economy. The reason they do that is that urban dwellers in California are actually very good at conserving water. We're much better at it than Central Valley growers. Why? Because the Central Valley growers get a policy that is etched in stone. And the centerpiece of it is seniority rights. So in the Central Valley of California, if you've been farming for 30 years and you're using irrigation, which of course you are, then you are enjoying seniority rights. And it's very hard to reduce the allocation of water to people that enjoy these rights. In a 2001 study, the Natural Resources Defense Council, an environmental advocacy group, analyzed an alfalfa farm using 240 acre feet of water in a given year. That's approximately 80 million gallons. It generated $60,000 in sales and employed 3 workers. But a California semiconductor plant using the same amount of water generated 5,000 times that much in sales, 300 million, while providing jobs for 2,000 people. Citizens might think of reasons why agriculture should continue to use so much water. Tradition, perhaps, or the argument that keeping land in agriculture is one way to keep it from being used instead of urban sprawl. But the argument that is taking water away from these crops is bad for the economy, well, that argument simply doesn't hold water. The economy would probably be in much better shape if more of the water were to go to other uses. This might well include an option that is generally not defined as beneficial use under Western water law, namely being returned to streams, which would improve survival chances of fish and attract new economic activity in the forms of recreation. So this is yet another depiction of what you're seeing of the 180 million acre feet that fall. So it's a little under the 200 million acre feet. 90 million goes to, is the runoff, so that half evaporates. And then the 80% goes to ag and 20% goes to cities. This shows you then how are we making up the deficit. The deficit is being made up by groundwater extraction, or what some people call water mining. So you can see the trends there in groundwater supplies, particularly in the dry years. Here's a simpler version of the same graphic, and it shows you at least up to about 2012, 2015, the real depletion of groundwater storage change. What happens when you take water out of the ground is the ground sinks. The term is subsidence. The San Joaquin Valley in some regions has seen a subsidence of 100 feet. The reason is that water doesn't compress very well, but when you remove the water and you've left behind a space, the ground does compress. It collapses, it compresses, so that if it does rain again, that aquifer can't be recharged. It's a little bit like the sponge in your sink. When it's new, it works like a charm. It absorbs all the water, it's nice and thick and moist. After 3 weeks, it has crumpled into something flatter and drier, and you actually have to soak it in order to get it to work like a sponge again. Aquifers are like that. Once you collapse the cells of a sponge, it's not a sponge anymore. Once you collapse the ground of an aquifer, it's not an aquifer anymore. Another problem with groundwater removal or groundwater mining is something that we see in coastal aquifers. This would be true, for instance, of Ventura County. So Ventura County is, in fact, a farm-intensive county, and that goes into all kinds of analysis of when you have rich agricultural land that is so proximate to a metropolitan area, like Ventura County, it allows you to grow very specialized crops and allows you to grow them very intensively. So there's a big difference, and that's generally true of California, that a lot of the crops we grow are grown intensively. They take a lot of capital, they take a lot of water, they often take a lot of farm labor, and in the process, then we get such luxury crops as kiwi fruit and strawberries. Well, in Ventura County, extractions of groundwater from the coastal aquifer have allowed the ocean to seep in and take its place. It's called saltwater intrusion. When that happens, you can contaminate your wells and contaminate your soil and essentially lose that groundwater supply. So Ventura County has done something very interesting, and that is they've protected the recharge area for their aquifer. The recharge area for Ventura's water is way up at the crest of the Tehachapi's. It's at the where Highway 5 meets Lebec. That's if you drive left or west from that peak in the Highway 5, you're in the Ventura County watershed. And so they prohibit any kind of development in that recharge area. No concrete slabs, no houses, no condos, no hotels. It's meant to actually recharge the aquifer for what is a lot more valuable to them, and that is their farm sector. The water supply in the state, this particular mapping, by the way, is supplied by a wonderful issue of National Geographic, where they go into very detailed analysis by acre foot. And it takes a long time to actually read this particular map, but let's just call this one supply. And you can see that northern coast really has all the water. In fact, it has so much that they had to break up the column, both for Sacramento River and North Coast, because it would be off the scale to show you how much fresh water they actually have. The other thing that this map does is that it makes a distinction between the kind of water use in those particular districts. So the very small one you see at the top is quote unquote recycled water. And then the purple one is groundwater. And then the lighter violet one is surface water. So in northern counties and northern regions of the state where the population is relatively low, you see this very large percentage of the water is actually surface water. As you move south toward the central coast, but particularly in the south coast, you can see that our water supply is considerably smaller. And they've included in this particular map, the Colorado River, since we depend so much on that. So these are what are called dedicated water supplies, and they're measured in millions of acre feet. The data here being drawn from the early aughts and the late 90s. But it does make a distinction between precipitation and recycled water and groundwater. This is the use, where it comes from, where it goes. Now, this is something that is what irks the Central Valley growers, because what you see in these columns is this category called environmental. And that is, by law, California is not allowed to destroy whole rivers and lakes and streams for the purpose of supplying agriculture or cities with water. That is, they have to allow some of the water to go through. That is, they have to keep the stream alive. That includes salmon and everything else. That category is known as environmental. And this is a great resentment because, in the part of the growers, because they see it as wasted water. Remember that the cynics say that the growers in California won't be happy until they get the last drop. Agricultural, you can see, is the big one, and Tulare Lake, as in terms of a water province or water region in California, is the biggest user. So Jerry Brown's twin tunnels that were going to convey water from the Sacramento River was really going to go to Tulare Lake and not to Los Angeles. But one of the ways you can sell water policy to Californians is to tell them that it's to increase the water needs of a growing population. If you just keep saying that often enough, people will actually believe it. But what you can see from what I just read, what you're really doing is you're supplying a lot of profligate growers in the Central Valley with water at bottom basement prices so they can grow the silliest stuff in the world, alfalfa. So this is another way of looking at that 200 million acre feet distribution, and the environmental category there being wetlands and in-stream flows, and then ag being 54% and urban being 14%. So that's where it comes from and where it goes. So here are the projects. The big one that we're not so familiar with in Southern California is the Central Valley Project, but we did see in the video what that entails. And it's actually a series of aqueducts. This becomes a very interesting problem because there's both federal money and state money in the building of aqueducts. However, way back in the early 20th century, the federal restriction for receiving federal water was an acreage limit. And that acreage limit was 160 acres. So you couldn't irrigate with federal water more than 160 acres. Now, there's been a workaround for that for the longest time, and it's a real amazing story of subterfuge and corruption in the Central Valley, particularly around something called the Westlands Water District and the Miller Lux Ranch. And the way that they acquired their water rights was given some primitive writing of the law that said if you could row a boat around the perimeter of land, you could claim the land for irrigation. So what did Mr. Lux do? He put a rowboat on the back of a wagon, had the horse go around the property. Said, I rowed the boat around the edge That's how he got his land. Okay, so there's just one story after another in terms of the depravity of California water policy. So that fight between the Westlands Water District and the federal government went on for decades and decades and decades until the Obama administration threw in the towel and said, the feds aren't going to prevail on this. We'll back off from suing you and you can have all the water you want. The Colorado River system is, in fact, a very, very important bone of contention because Arizona also and other riparian states, many states that have banks of the Colorado River, also have claims to that water. And as their cities and populations grow, also including that their irrigated agricultural sector grows, then they can increase their claims. And so that means that Los Angeles can't go on assuming that we get the same amount of Colorado River water that in the future that we've gotten in the past. And it is indeed a beautiful exotic stream is what geographers call a river that runs through a desert. It is one of the most dramatic landscapes in the United States is the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. Today, it's experiencing a drought that has been unseen in 30 years. San Francisco gets its water from a dam called Hetch Hetchy, which is built actually on the Tuolumne River. Is it? Yes, directly north of Yosemite. This is the dam that broke John Muir's heart, so that when Teddy Roosevelt came out and made Yosemite another national park after Yellowstone, the splitting of the ways was between John Muir and his dear buddy Gifford Pinchot. And that's where we ended up with the dual policy in as far as federal lands go between national parks, which are preserved, and national forests, which are conserved. So Pinchot was a conservationist, Muir was a preservationist. Muir lost the argument, they built the dam. San Francisco had had its earthquake, it's had its fire, it needed two things, water and electricity. To this day, Hetch Hetchy provides water and electricity to San Francisco, though interestingly, it's operated by Pacific Gas and Electric, even though it's a municipally owned utility. A lot of people in San Francisco resent that. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, here's our friend William Mulholland, who then in the turn of the century, with a good friend of his, go up to secure the water reserves of the Owens Valley, which is at higher elevation than Los Angeles. Mulholland, for all of his quirks, was actually a genius, a brilliant person, self-taught. He was not even an engineer, but he became one. And he developed a system to not only steal the water from the Owens Valley, but to have it travel by gravity all the way to LA. There are no pumping stations between the Owens Valley and Los Angeles. It just goes uphill and downhill using siphons, using all kinds of engineering tricks to have gravity deliver that water to the city. Later, in the 1970s, a second aqueduct was built for the Owens Valley, increasing the water flow from the Owens to LA by 50%. That said, the fights then ensued because the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is the agency that actually manages that water, running out of water at the Owens Valley, decided to reach higher into the Mono Lake Basin. And we'll touch on that in a minute. The Mokelumne is actually what supplies water to the East Bay. So that is the East Bay Municipal Utilities District. And then the State Water Project does deliver water to Southern California. That is our third supply, Colorado River, Owens Valley, and the State Water Project. You can see them sort of arriving here. The pink one being the California Aqueduct, that's the State Water Project. This one over, the orange one is the Colorado River and its aqueducts. And then the Owens, and now with its parallel aqueduct, is the Los Angeles Aqueduct that has its terminus in Sylmar in the San Fernando Valley. There are really technically two watersheds to the Colorado because it does reach all the way up into Wyoming and maybe even to the Canadian border. But you can see that it drains into the Sea of Cortez right across the border from Arizona into the states of Sonora in Baja California and Mexico. That delta used to carry all of the water of the Colorado. Today, it's a muddy flat. We divert so much water in the Colorado watershed that Mexico hardly gets what should be, their fair share of the river, even though they do use Colorado River water to irrigate some of their northern Mexican export crop regions, as you have around Mexicali and you have in certain valleys that are sort of border valleys with Arizona and California. John Wesley Powell, interesting bloke. He actually perceived the idea of having boundaries in the United States follow their watersheds. very novel notion, because he was concerned for equality and he was concerned for availability. So these are actually physical watersheds of all of the major drainage basins of the Western states. And that exercise has been repeated here. So you can see all the major watersheds of the quote unquote lower 48 states, as well as in Hawaii and Alaska on the bottom there. But you can see how the one in the middle, number 11, is the Ogallala Aquifer. It's the largest freshwater aquifer groundwater deposit in the United States. And today it's being mined by agriculture. As far as LA is concerned, this would be, well, this is as far as the Colorado River is concerned, the total system storage has varied a lot between 1960 and today. And in fact, it reached its peak somewhere between the 1980s and the beginning of this century, where maybe the Lake Powell storage was at its greatest. Lake Mead has sort of stayed the same until now, where it's now at half of its capacity. And Lake Powell, these are the lakes that are behind the Hoover Dam and the biggest dams on the Colorado River. And then there's other system storage, which is the smaller dams. When understanding water transfers in the state, one of the things that the state water authorities do is they divide the state into these distinct hydrologic regions, and then they show you how much moves from one region to another. The big one being between the Sacramento River and the San Francisco Bay. That is the thickest arrow here. That is, what's the count there? 18,156, is it millions of acre feet? It is in acre feet. And that's the average water year. So you can see that there are dry areas like the North Lahontan and the South Lahontan, and there are wet ones like the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin. The San Francisco Bay then gets its water from Hetch Hetchy. That's actually delivered to the upper Crystal Lakes reservoirs. If you've ever driven up to the Bay Area along this Skyline Freeway, you see these very large reservoirs, which are the water supply for San Francisco. Contra Costa Canal supplies the East Bay, and the North Bay Aqueduct supplies actually Napa Valley with a lot of the water it needs for the wine industry. So the Bay Area is, it's an interesting area. I spent 16 years there, and one of the things I noticed in Bay Area snobbery is this perception that LA is taking all the water. They love to say that. I think they even have like, let's bash LA for 5 minutes. You know, let's go to a cafe and bash LA for 5 minutes. It's true, they do. Nobody here bashes the Bay Area, but for some reason, Bay Area people have this strange idea that LA is taking all the water. And nothing is further from the truth. Most of the water in the state is really there for the agricultural sector. And the biggest user of electricity in the state is to pump that water over the Tehachapi Mountains. But the Bay Area, for all of its beauty and mild climate, the rest of it is a sprawl area, a lot like the one we live in. So they might not perceive this, but all you have to do is see the expansion of the BART system to see how far away people now have to live if they work in the Bay Area. So this shows you the total water use in a region and the water exports from the Delta. So there's the big one. Tulare Lake, it does get the lion's share of Delta water, as does the San Joaquin River province, which is directly north of it. There is an interesting kind of physical boundary between those two watershed systems, those two parts of the valley. But suffice to say that they get the lion's share. You can see that total water use in the region, of course, for the northern counties is strictly what they get in precipitation. So there's a series of slides that actually tell the story of how Mulholland stole the water. One of the ways they did it was to obtain riparian rights. And in Western water and in California law, if you own land that's contiguous to or abuts with the bank of a river, then you have more rights to that water than someone who's further away. That's called riparian rights. And what Mulholland and his friend did was they traveled up and down the Owens Valley pretending to be ranchers and buying land, just enough land so that the city of Los Angeles through the LADWP could then claim the riparian rights of the Owens River, which was done. In 1913, the Owens River was turned into the aqueduct, and the rest is history. The second one then was done in the 1970s, but the crisis was the destruction of the Owens Lake. These are old lakes. Mono Lake and the Owens Lake are old Pleistocene lakes, meaning they were caused by the Ice Age. The ice retreated and left behind these terminal valleys that have no exit. So when water builds up in the Owens Valley, it gets saline, it gets salty. In fact, Mono Lake is twice as salty as the ocean, and nonetheless supports a lot of life. It is, as the video pointed out, a major stopover for migrating bird species. But it was the battle to save Mono Lake that brought about the biggest change in California water policy regarding LA and the LADWP. It was litigated for decades between a very tiny little committee called the Save Mono Lake Committee and the LADWP, which has a lot more money and a lot more lawyers. But ultimately, a judge decided that killing Mono Lake was not in the interest of the state and required that the LADWP split the baby. So at Levining Creek, there's a dam that takes 50% of the water, puts that in the aqueduct, and lets the other 50% flow freely to Mono Lake to keep the lake level and to keep adding fresh water to what is a very, very salty lake. This is Mono Lake. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend it. There's so many beautiful things to see in California. The eastern side of the Sierra Nevada, known as the Scarp, is dry. It's the lee side of the mountain, so it doesn't get a lot of precipitation. And this is Mono Lake in one of its sort of average heights, where the islands are actually islands. At its worst, so much water was removed or deprived of arriving to the Mono Lake that the islands became connected to the mainland, and that endangered the thousands of migrating birds that make that island their rookery. You can see in the foreground how steep the Sierra Nevada suddenly drops down into the Owens Valley. And it's a beautiful, breathtaking valley. It's surrounded by the White Mountains to the east and the Sierra Nevada to the west. And it's the most majestic image of the Sierra you'll ever see, because it's a scarp. It's a wall of granite, snow, and pine trees. And you travel from Mono Lake all the way down to Los Angeles through Bridgeport and through, well, I'm thinking of Lee Vining, Bishop, Lone Pine, and they're wonderful little towns. Some people even remark, if Mulholland hadn't stolen the water from the Owens Valley, it would be covered with condos today. So this is the deal that was struck to save Lee Vining Creek and to save Mono Lake. And ultimately, the LADWP buried the hatchet. They made friends with the Save Mono Lake Committee, and now the LADWP even contributes financially to that committee, and some of its members actually work with the LADWP on the management of Owens Valley water. So that fight ended. However, there's another one, which is, remember, the Owens Lake, which is south of Mono Lake, is bone dry, and that was shown in the video. The problem with that is the dust. It's actually really dusty. The winds are very high. Notice how dry the Owens Valley is. So this is what's left of the Owens Lake, and it makes living there really difficult. So another lawsuit demanded that the LADWP do something about the dust. And they agreed to actually either cover it with rocks and pebbles or to even flood it with an inch or two of water just to prevent the dust. It's actually the largest ecological restoration project on Earth. And recently, the LADWP notified the judge that they can't comply anymore, that there's just not enough water to rehabilitate the Owens and to split the baby with Mono. So that is a real problem, and it's a sign of our drier climate and our inability, or maybe our assumptions, that the water hydraulic regime, if we want to call it that we've enjoyed for 100 years has changed radically in our lifetimes. So there's the dust. That's why the lawsuits. This is where Mulholland made the famous speech, the shortest speech in history, where he turned to the people when he opened the sluice at this particular, this is near Sylmar. He said, "There it is, take it." And that particular operation produces both hydroelectric power and delivers drinking water to Sylmar's filtration plant, which then delivers that water to a lot of Los Angeles. So LADWP water does come and still comes from the Owens Valley. There's the Cascades that we call the Mulholland Falls, and that's what delivers. You can also see the second aqueduct on the left side there. And then this is the almost triumphant monument to that water that's in Griffith Park. This is sort of the end of that terminus of that process. But then let's look at LA in particular. When you look at LA in particular, you'll notice real changes since the year 2000 as far as the LA aqueduct is concerned. Remember that there's less precipitation, less water. LADWP is not allowed to basically drink all the water in the valley. That's why the blue bars get lower and lower. So we've had to buy more water from the Metropolitan Water District, which is Colorado River water. So that today, if you live in the San Fernando Valley or live in lots of parts of LA, you're getting a blend of the purchased water from the Colorado and the delivered water from the Owens Valley. And then you have this interesting category, local groundwater. And there is, in fact, very significant reservoirs of local groundwater in LA that are either contaminated or just underutilized. San Fernando Valley is a good example because it has a very big aquifer. It's surrounded by mountains. So all the precipitation on the Santa Monica Mountains and the Verdugos and the Santa Susana, they drain into the LA River, but very importantly, they recharge the aquifer. Now we've paved over the San Fernando Valley. So the US Army Corps of Engineers and the LADWP have set up recharge basins where when it rains a lot, they divert that surface water into very porous surfaces that then slowly recharge the aquifer. But cities like Burbank and Pasadena do in fact draw their drinking water from these aquifers. Here is what I think is reasons why we should be, I want to say proud to be Angelenos. The population of the state between 1970 and 2018, and you can see that it grew quite a bit. Not of the state, excuse me, the city of LA. Okay, this is city of LA. This isn't the county of LA. This isn't the 88 cities in the county, and it isn't the larger conurbation that includes Ventura County and Riverside and Orange and San Bernardino. This is city of Los Angeles, and you can see by 2018 had reached a population of 4 million, but from a 1970s population of 2.83 million. So at a time when the population of the city grew, notice that the demand for water declined because Angelenos did a lot to conserve water. Some of it is just built into the building codes, the low flow shower heads, the 2 flush toilets, the ripping out of the green lawns and replacing them with native plants. LA people have done a lot of that. And that's why today we're at 112 gallons per person per day from where we were in a much more profligate period at a close to more than 700 gallons per person per day, or excuse me, acre feet. Gallons is a different measure there. This is in gallons and this is in acre feet. How then to find new sources of water? The most important new sources of water are actually found in something called conservation. Just not use it the way we use it. We actually are quite wasteful with water, as we saw earlier with alfalfa and cotton. So the agricultural sector could save as much as 6.6 million acre feet if it adopted things like drip irrigation. It stopped the process of flood irrigation, and it questioned the distribution of water to people with seniority rights. The rule is use it or lose it. So if you've been allocated so many acre feet this year, you better use it, because next year, if you didn't use it, they'll ratchet you down to what you used. So that is an incentive for the growers in the Central Valley to be wasteful in order to secure their allocation next year that they got last year. Stormwater capture is something we don't do enough. Now, we do get very seasonal precipitation in most of the state. And that's why, even though we get 14 inches on average historically in Los Angeles per year, 14 inches of rain, in fact, it falls usually November, December, January. That's it. So it's difficult to capture that water when it's concentrated in such a small period of time. That said, there are ways of building stormwater capture systems. And in fact, this is probably one of the more promising sources of water for Los Angeles, would be stormwater capture. So urban efficiency would save as much as 5.2 million acre feet. Notice that the agricultural efficiency, the best we can hope for, is 6.6 million acre feet. So urban people are much better at conserving water than the very pampered agricultural sector of the Central Valley. This shows you total water supply and demand and changes for drought response strategies. A lot of words there, all by way of saying this is, they broke it down by hydrologic regions in order to appreciate the potential for agricultural efficiency. And then you can see for the South Coast that in fact it's the urban efficiency potential, and it's a very large pie chart. So urban people were asked by then Governor Jerry Brown to curtail their water use. This was during the last drought we had. And he set a deadline, I think, of 2020 for reductions of 25%. Los Angeles met that reduction a year or two ahead of schedule. So when you ask Angelenos to save water, gosh darn it, they do. This is the per capita savings that we get sort of at the residential level, because the biggest users of water when it comes to consumers in an urban economy are in fact households. A lot of it is that we have the crazy green lawn, which is a crazy thing, and that we use a lot of appliances that use a lot of water. But one I find here that gets a redemption is the dishwasher. It's probably one of the most efficient water use appliances there is your dishwasher. It uses a lot less water than you would use if you were washing the dishes yourself. And it recycles the water. So dishwashers come out as being far more efficient than, though you could see the real problems with things like leaking toilets and leak repair, which is a major source of water loss in the household level. Recycled water use, this would be 1970 to 2009, and you can see that little smidge of in the column that was called recycled is actually growing. Now, what we call recycled water isn't necessarily the processing of wastewater. It might be, for example, just recharging an aquifer. As you can see there, 20% would be a recharged aquifer, or agricultural irrigation or urban irrigation. These are all areas in which recycling water matters. But what we do in the LA Community College District, and what we do now, I think nationally, is to formalize the process whereby recycled water can be used. And that, we call it the purple pipe. So when you see purple pipes at Valley College, or you see it at Southwest College, you're seeing that compliance with the design and build of our campuses to meet the water conservation goals. So we have swales to catch stormwater, and we recycle water in order to do such things as wash cars and water lawns. And, it doesn't have to be drinking water. Now, that's also true at the household level. We have a single system where you have perfectly good drinking water that comes in from the water main into your house. And then we have one pipe out, which is sewage. So we don't distinguish when the wastewater goes out, we don't distinguish between water that must be treated because it's highly contaminated with human waste, and water that isn't. So building a secondary water system at the household level for gray water. So gray water is non-sewage. There's no human waste in it. It's the water that comes out of your washing machine and out of your dishwasher and so on. It has great potential. And in fact, it used to be illegal. So the famous actor Ed Begley Jr., who's a graduate of Valley College, came and gave a speech to us and told us he had to hire a pirate plumber to replumb his house to separate the gray water from the sewage, which he did. Years later, the Metropolitan Water District and the LADWP have finally legalized that kind of plumbing. And in fact, it's a major source of future water. Now, the other one is water recycling. This is wastewater recycling. And people freak out and think, what? Because it has this funny little phrase, toilet to tap. In Orange County, they like to call it showers to flowers. But the idea is you're taking, in this case, real wastewater. This is sewage, and you're bringing it up to potable water standards. You're improved even to the point where it exceeds the EPA standards for drinking water. And they do this in Orange County today and have met a lot of their water needs around Santa Ana with recycling sewage. Now, we do this a little bit in the San Fernando Valley at the Tillman plant, but we only take liquid wastewater. And in fact, the treatment there, which is quite good, it's fascinating in terms of the engineering, allows then the water authority to dump that water into the LA River. So that's one of the ways we keep the water level in the LA River running.
California has been suffering from a serious drought.
State health officials say 17 communities and water districts, mostly in rural areas, are now within 100 days of running dry.
They've now imposed steep fines for people who break the rules against the use of water outdoors.
In its worst drought since 1977.
This place in Orange County is already the biggest water reuse treatment plant in the world.
We consider wastewater not a waste, but a resource.
This plant is very important to protect
protecting the strategic reserves of water.
If we didn't have this water, we wouldn't be able to pump as much out of the basin.
We would have to import virtually all of our water.
But we've been able to maintain fairly constant levels.
Creating a virtually, over time, a self-sustaining water supply.
And it's going to get even bigger, which is a good thing because California is in the middle of a historic drought.
While we're standing right here, just to point out, we're kind of in the middle of the construction zone. Yeah, right off here is where we're expanding the facility from 70 million gallons to 100 million gallons. So we're only about 6-7 months away from having an additional 30 million gallons per day. And it'll provide an additional source of water for about 250,000 people. So it's very significant.
It goes out two ways. Once, to form a natural barrier against salt water. The second is to replenish groundwater reserves. Water from this plant already accounts for 20% of the water recharging Orange County's groundwater reserves. Now that's crucial in this drought because California is draining those reserves rapidly, and one day the water could run out.
So you ask how bad this drought is, and it's very bad. It may be the worst drought on record. With the possibility of climate change being very strong, this may end up being the new normal.
The water from the sanitation district actually comes from the big blue pipe.
Treated wastewater comes into the plant and goes through 3 separate cleaning and filtration processes.
Right now, we're entering the microfiltration area. We're actually filtering water right now. That water is secondary effluent. Right now, we're in the RO building or the reverse osmosis building. This is the second step in the treatment process. We're removing any dissolved minerals, viruses, or pharmaceuticals in the water. We've basically taken everything out of the water. Shall we go for a dip?
So it's becoming an increasingly attractive option as California continues to go through these cycles of drought.
In fact, it uses half the energy that it takes to move water from Northern California to Southern California, and about a third of the energy that it would take to desalinate seawater.
I think it is inevitable that Californians are going to have to get beyond this notion of toilet to tap.
We prefer showers to flowers.
I think we will see more reuse of wastewater in California and throughout the West.
So we've seen how the sausage is made. Now let's see how it tastes. Okay, well, I'm thirsty, so okay, bottom cheers. Clink. Yeah, maybe a slight aftertaste, but yeah, it's perfectly fine. I would drink this.
Absolutely.
It's just a little different. And I would imagine people would get used to this. So now I'm having another sip. I've tasted the water. I feel fine. This water is totally safe to drink. But until California changes its rules, this water is not going to be coming to a tap near you.
I believe in the state of California will be able to do direct potable reuse within about the next 5 years. We still don't have the regulatory framework that allows us to do direct potable. So we're working on it. Once people know more and more about a project like this, a groundwater replenishment system, the more that they accept it. That's what recycled water gives you. It gives you that water supply reliability. We have control over this source of water. We have control over our own destiny.
So toilet to tap, showers to flowers. But recycling wastewater is actually very cost effective compared to the other options, which are prohibitive. This is the capturing of stormwater, which is also something we could do. In Sun Valley, there is actually a showcase park underneath the baseball diamonds that does exactly that, and it does filter stormwater. And if we filtered stormwater to the point of making it potable, then that's yet another water supply that remains underutilized. But a lot of stormwater can just be captured off the rooftop of a house, put into a tank or a cistern, and used at the household level for all of the non-drinking water purposes. But it is, in fact, the possible future of water for California to the extent that we get any storms at all. Storm drains in Santa Monica have been rerouted to a very cute little thing called the Smurf. That is the Santa Monica Urban Runoff Recycling Facility. It's right there at the base of the pier. You've walked by this thing 1,000 times and never noticed what it is. Its footprint is so small, and yet it is a Cadillac of stormwater recycling. So that stormwater used to go out to the bay and pollute the bay. Now it gets filtered at this plant, gets re-injected into the aquifer, and is used by the city of Santa Monica for watering parks and medians and so on. So there is a lot of the water that we waste today, the potable water that we waste today, could be in fact addressed by using this kind of gray water or stormwater. This is a very simple view of the LA River, but it does show you its watershed, which is that everything in the gray zone there drains into the LA River. In the San Fernando Valley, we have, as I mentioned to you earlier, a very, very large aquifer. However, given the industrial history of the San Fernando Valley, a lot of that aquifer is contaminated. So the LAWP and the Army Corps of Engineers do two things. One is they recharge the aquifer on in the northern eastern part of the San Fernando Valley, which is the Tujunga Wash and the Pacoima Wash. And then in other areas of the San Fernando Valley, they're actually pumping the contaminated water from the ground up into a facility that will then filter it and put it back as good drinking water. The plan is for 4 facilities. Right now, I think one has been, maybe 1 or 2 are complete, one of them being in North Hollywood. But they would, in fact, remove, I won't go into the details of what needs to be removed, but these are all highly toxic substances from the aerospace industry. So the processes are similar to what you saw in Orange County: reverse osmosis, aeration, ozone treatment, ultraviolet light, all kinds of things are done to make this water potable. Desal, I have to end on this one because it's always an issue. Desalination, there is one in Carlsbad, California. The costs are prohibitive. The carbon footprint is prohibitive. It takes a lot of energy to desalinate water, and it does raise interesting questions. What are you going to do about the brine? What are you going to do with all the salt you took out? So there are major concerns and impacts when it comes, and basically the cost of desalinated water matches, the price you pay for a latte at Starbucks. It's just really, the only countries doing it today are countries that either they really, really have to, or they have so much money that it doesn't matter, like the Persian Gulf states. One of the plans then for dumping that then use salt back into is to use a slant well and to bury it deep underneath the seafloor. That's one of the ways of justifying this particular project. But releasing it back into the same water that it came from will only destroy the coastal aquifers. So I want to leave you with a couple of books. Dorothy Green, wonderful person in Los Angeles. She founded Heal the Bay, and she founded Friends of the LA River. She wrote this book. She's passed away, but she wrote this book some time ago, and it's all kinds of good ideas on how we could conserve water. This is a sort of famous UC Press book by John Fleck that basically calls into question the myth of, is water something that we fight over and whiskey something that we drink. It's attributed to Mark Twain. I don't think he ever said it. It's right up there with the coldest winter I ever spent was the summer in San Francisco. He didn't say that either, but and then finally, can the city be sustainable? This is from the World Watch Institute. It looks more generically at any city, but it asks the question that we're all asking ourselves in Los Angeles. Can we make Los Angeles a sustainable or greener city? And when you actually poll Angelenos on these issues of environment, you find out that they're usually in the top 3. And that's true across the board. They've done interviews with, for example, Latino voters in Los Angeles, and they ask them, what are your top 3 priorities? And they will normally say education, healthcare, and environment. So it shouldn't be an elite concern of upper middle class white people in Malibu, okay? It is everybody's concern. Making our city livable, making it sustainable is all of our business, and doing that equitably so that you don't have the bads close to the working class communities and the goods concentrated among upper class communities, which is very transparent, very obvious today when you just look at a map of Los Angeles. So this is what we don't want. We don't want to trash our planet. We don't want to see dirty water be the reason why we can't live here anymore. The teaching resources that are available, and I'm expanding on this on our website, I've now put about 4 on water, and this recording itself will also be posted. I will share the link when I get it from Zoom with Lourdes, and then you'll be able to use it. I'll also try to take the content some of these slides and make them available to you through that website, which is our Sustainable Environment Institute of the it's us. That is us. And we're very happy to have been able to participate in this, the first of our monthly chats, workshops, seminars on California environment. Feel free to ask questions. You can hold down your space bar, and hopefully I'll hear you.
Very good.
Oh, got some applauses. Thank you for the applauses. I was wondering if I could fit it all in. Racing the clock there. And
there is a lot to digest in this topic, for sure. But you know, my name is Jesus Sanchez. I'm actually chef instructor at Los Angeles Mission College. In to see the trade tech is leading. And to that respect, I actually teach a class in clean technology and touch every aspect that you touch about it regarding the water conservation. And I think one of the things that I would say is that we really need to educate our leaders as far as those leading the resources. For example, the managers on the plant facility side, where we really need to ensure that we support all of these efforts, right? For example, in Mission College, we have a culinary building, which we normally throw away roughly, 250,000 gallons of water every other day. And we want to conserve that water. And, we try to have a garden and recycle and do all of that good stuff. So, I've worked with several institutions where we actually have some funding. And because it wasn't support greatly within the structure, so more or less we had to get the money back. But I think I'm really, really pleased to see this. I'm looking forward to the next set of classes or workshops, to say the least, and be part of it. Mission College, working with Trade Tech and the new culinary building, and using recycling all of the water where we wash dishes, might as well as good use for it. Thank you for sharing. Awesome.
Well, no, thank you, Jesus. On the contrary, thank you for your comments. And it's good to know that you're teaching at Mission, because I always want a database of all the faculty who teach environment and engineering and architecture, and for that matter, environmental studies and geography, because we really want to outreach constantly. You might be pleased to know that the Sustainable Environment Institute has been working with facilities downtown. Dr. Ruben Smith, who's now the head of facilities, has some very ambitious goals, mostly around energy and buildings. But I tell my students that if there's one place in Los Angeles where you have 3 LEED platinum buildings that are only a few hundred yards away from each other, it's Mission College. You have more LEED platinum buildings than any other part of LA. I think students that go to Mission College, just by being on that campus, learn a whole lot about sustainability in the built environment as far as buildings are concerned. So water is something that facilities wants to approach, and that's why we do have our mandated purple pipes and increased water recycling. So I'll be happy to cover that when we get to, we're going to have a whole workshop on net zero buildings and being able to reduce the carbon footprint of our HVAC systems and so on. So thank you, Jesus, for that contribution. I will stay in touch. And in fact, I see your email. I'm going to write that down, which is Sanchez.
Sanchez yeah.
Yes, at Mission. Oh, LACCD.
That'll be great if I can actually use some of those slides on my class. Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. A lot of information to digest, that's for sure.
I'm thinking of either putting them in a zip file and posting the zip file on the website, or actually dropping them into a PowerPoint. My experience with PowerPoint, though, is that they get really big. It's like a gigabyte, forget about it. So if I can then post the 2 video clips separately, and then you can use them at any time. And that would leave just the slides, which I think will fit as a zip file.
That'll be awesome. That's beautiful.
Dr. Letty, I have a question. My name is Iram Sayed, and I teach microbiology at LA Southwest College. And I like your presentation a lot. Was very helpful and informative. So I have a question. I'm wondering if you are going to talk about water recycling treatment process in your future meetings, so that I can talk about with my students, microbiology student, as a water treatment is our part of our core syllabus as well. So
yeah, I would very happily do that. I haven't actually shared the topics that go from now till November. But I think we will have opportunities to discuss that because, well, I take my students to the Tillman wastewater treatment plant at Sepulveda Basin, which is right adjacent to the Japanese tea gardens, and when we could back in the day. And it is fascinating, the process of wastewater treatment and getting it. They want to add yet another stage to Tillman that would allow them to do what Orange County does, which is to bring it to a potable water standard. Right now, it's just below that, which is why they put it right into the LA River. The same is true of the Smurf in Santa Monica. They have an application pending for a 4th stage of the treatment that would also allow that stormwater to reach potable standards. So a lot of what right now is just filtration and reduction of contaminants, ideally can be moved up another step to actually meet the EPA standards for drinking water, and that would expand maybe greatly our drinking water supplies for LA. So thank you, Dr. Sayed, because that's I would very gladly share that, anything I have on that with you. Let's do wastewater treatment. Wastewater treatment. And you've probably seen that there are going to be maybe, fines levied. This is, in fact, as you saw from earlier slides, a very alarming period. It's in fact worse than what we had in 2016, 2017. It's the question is a drought a passing thing that comes and goes? Are droughts cyclical, or are we in a period of increased aridity? Aridity is the West basically drying up like a prune? Is the California wine grape becoming a raisin? And it's a very important point because climate change does present these challenges, these persistent high pressure domes that actually come from what's happened to the Arctic. So when we talk about climate, we'll see that a disproportionate amount of what we call global warming is concentrated in the northernmost parts of the planet, the Arctic Circle, which has not only melted a whole lot of the ice that floats at the North Pole, but it's also upset the meteorology of the Northern Hemisphere, creating very big differences in the jet stream and allowing for this very freakish kind of events like 115 degrees in Vancouver that has never been recorded before. So when we talk about climate, we will look at some of these meteorological effects and all of their implications for water supplies and precipitation. So we can't rely on what we've been used to in terms of the hydrologic cycle and the water regime for the last 50, 100 years. We are really facing a sea change. Well, with that, it's amazing. We actually got this done on time today. So I've learned a thing or two.
You have time for another question?
Oh, yes.
Hi, this is David. So, hi, I'm sorry I was unable to hear the early part of the presentation. We have a few more minutes, don't we?
Yes, absolutely.
So, George, my question about water conservation, and you've heard me say this before, but part of me doesn't want to participate. Part of me resists conserving water because we are in a drought. We need to do something, but the county still is willing to allow the development of Fort Tejon. How can they allow suburban development so far away? I mean, it's, 50 miles from LA, 50 miles from Bakersfield? It's going to be a huge community. How can that be anything but an enormous water hog? And, we're supposed to shrug and say, well, it just has to be that way. I mean, I realize there are other environmental issues with the development like Fort Tejon. I call it Fort Tejon. What's the other name for it?
Emerson Ranch or
Newhall Ranch.
Newhall, yes.
Newhall Ranch. But we're talking about 50, 60,000 people, aren't we? It's quite a large development.
Very large, very large.
I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It just seems to me, I just would like to see the county government, finally embrace this conundrum and just say no to it. But last word was they approved it last year. I know
Was it
there's
last
further
year?
legal action, but not from the county board. The counties. So, what do you say about that to people who feel like we're getting suckered a bit here?
Well, I agree. I think that suburban sprawl is in and of itself a problem, particularly for Tejon and Newhall. But the water hookups, when I lived in Santa Barbara County, we had one of our many droughts. The state water project had not been completed to Santa Barbara County. So they had a moratorium on water hookups, which basically put the brakes on all new development. It preserved a lot of the very beautiful landscape of the western side of the county, which is today, interestingly, avocado orchards, and they suck up a lot of water. I agree. I don't blame urban people for their water use. I have a friend who's so frugal with water, it almost makes me laugh. And I think, Giovanni, you don't have to worry about washing your hands. You really have to worry about the alfalfa in the Central Valley. But it is difficult then to get compliance or interest on the part of the populace when they perceive that the authorities are making bad water decisions. And I think we're really surrounded by bad water decisions. And as I mentioned, at least in the case of agriculture, the use it or lose it rule, the seniority rules, the permits for flood irrigation that you see in the Central Valley, that just has to change. It's just very difficult politically given their clout in Sacramento. But we really need a reckoning with the idea that even though California is a breadbasket for the rest of the country and produces a lot of fruits and vegetables and so on, it isn't actually the most significant sector of our economy, even though they want to tell you that it is. And so I think urban water use should actually get more attention than it's getting because urban people are so good at conservation, as we saw today. It's interesting that Angelenos have, in a time of major population growth, reduced their water use. That I find heartening, and I think it's a good example, but you're right, we cannot go on the way we did in the 60s and 50s with building more suburbs, individual houses with all of their single water use, one pipe in, one pipe out. That's just nuts. But we have seen in some research we've done on gray water recycling that there are some developments that are being built in California where the purple pipe is actually built from the very beginning. It isn't added on later. So they're building these houses, but they are putting in the two water systems, the potable water and the gray water, and then the way of disposing of that. So that should help a bit because there really is a lot of water that we could get just through conservation alone. We think, desalination, but actually the biggest promise is in wastewater treatment and conservation. Recycling water holds better promise than desalinating the Pacific Ocean. But we like the tech, we get suckered in by the fact that it's technologically cutting edge. But I think the more prosaic actions are actually far more effective. But you raise a very good point. And I see it's sad that, for example, we would sacrifice urban parks and trees in Los Angeles by not watering them to meet our water reduction needs. And in the process, sacrifice the tree canopy and the vegetation and all the water that's needed by animals, by the birds and so on. And that does happen when you really stop watering things. So I think we need to conserve those green areas of the city that actually reduce the heat dome and that supply habitat for animals and that just make for a more pleasant landscape. I know that David's house has the most beautiful Morton fig tree. And I don't think it's a big water sucker, but it is a huge tree. And it's just one of the many beautiful things that we need in a city such as LA. We don't need more dead trees. And that's one of my concerns. I don't know if I actually addressed your question fully, but I do concur that building more suburbs 50 miles away from Los Angeles ill-advised, and it took years of litigation to actually force that thing through. And it makes you wonder, it's a little bit like the Playa Vista development, in the Bayona Creek, where years of litigation ended up with a favorable outcome for the investors and the developers against the ecological needs of Bayona Creek or the Bayona estuary. So yeah, I think that the city should really concentrate on the theories of new urbanism, which involve infill and density corridors and transit hubs, and not more cookie cutter suburbs 50 miles away from the urban core. That's my take on the need for redefinition of urban life that we need in LA. The whole city is 1 and 2 stories high. Well, if there's, we're actually running up against, it's almost 1. I think that is in fact, our ending time today. So a month from now, we will have yet another workshop, and I'll create flyers for that. Let me see if I have, it will be on the challenge of decarbonizing the economy. And then I put parenthetically, and the pension funds, by stopping fossil fuel extraction and investments in coal, oil, and gas. That one promises to be a doozy because it has some controversial issues in it. But as my friend David knows, the urge to divest from the pension funds that have in the portfolio coal, oil, and natural gas is probably the most effective way of sending a message through the marketplace that we need to stop. Keep the stuff in the ground, stop investing in it, stop burning oil, coal, and natural gas, and move with breakneck speed toward renewables. And so we'll talk a lot about that in next month. So with that, it's now 1 o'clock. I'll stop the recording.